A honeymoon. A time meant for love, laughter, and the first unforgettable memories of a new life together. But for Jamal and Keisha Richardson, it became something else entirely. A descent into terror, betrayal, and unspeakable horror. They had just returned home, exhausted but happy, still basking in the glow of their wedding. Their suitcases were barely unpacked, their future wide open. They were supposed to spend the night wrapped in each other's arms, dreaming about the life they had just begun. But in just a few hours, everything would change. The safety of their home would be shattered. Their love would be tested in the cruelest way possible, and one of them would not make it out alive. The nightmare began with a knock at the door. It wasn't loud or aggressive, just a simple knock. A man on the other side of the door had lived just a few houses away for years. Darnell Hayes wasn't a stranger. He wasn't some masked intruder breaking in during the night. No, he was a neighbor, a man they had spoken to many times, a man who had smiled and waved whenever they crossed paths, a man who had even congratulated them on their wedding just days before. So when Jamal opened the door, there was no fear, no hesitation. Maybe Darnell needed help. Maybe something had happened. That's what Jamal must have thought. But within seconds, he realized his mistake. The friendly face they had come to trust twisted into something unrecognizable, cold, empty. The kind of look that turns a normal night into a nightmare. A gun was raised. A threat was made. And before Jamal could react, the door was shut behind him, and his world became a prison. Keisha, still upstairs, had no idea what was happening. She was in bed, scrolling through her phone, thinking about their honeymoon, thinking about their future, but the horror creeping up the stairs. But when she heard footsteps, heavy, unfamiliar footsteps, her heart must have stopped. She must have called out for Jamal. She must have expected to hear his voice. Instead, she saw something else. A gun. A pair of cold, merciless eyes. And her husband, tied up, helpless, completely at the mercy of a man they had once trusted. What happened was beyond cruelty. It was calculated. It was depraved. It was evil in its purest form. Darnell wasn't in a hurry. He wanted them to suffer. He wanted Jamal to watch. He wanted to take everything from them, strip them of their safety, their love, their dignity. And when he was done, he wanted to leave nothing behind but pain. This was not a crime of impulse. This was planned. This was something that had been building for weeks, maybe even months. Hidden beneath smiles and small talk, behind casual greetings and friendly gestures, Darnell had been watching, waiting. And when the moment was right, when he knew they were alone, he struck. And he made sure that night would be one that no one would ever forget. But the horror didn't end there. What happened inside that house shook an entire community. It would leave detectives speechless. It would haunt the only survivor for the rest of her life. Because the worst part of this story isn't just the crime itself. It's the fact that the monster who did this wasn't some stranger in the night. He was someone they trusted, someone they never saw coming. And the question that lingers, the question that will stay with you long after this story is over: how well do you really know the people living next door? June 2022, a suburban neighborhood in Huston, Texas. Jamal Richardson, 29, was a hard-working electrician. He was the type of man who always had a smile on his face, who took pride in providing for his family. Keisha Richardson, 27, was a kindergarten teacher, a woman with a warm heart, loved by her students and respected by her colleagues. They had just returned from a short trip to Galveston. Their honeymoon wasn't extravagant, but it was exactly what they wanted. Long walks on the beach, quiet dinners by the water, and the excitement of starting their new life as husband and wife. Darnell Hayes, 42, had lived in the neighborhood for years. He was a familiar face, someone who seemed ordinary, someone who blended in. He had a steady job at a warehouse, kept to himself for the most part, but was always friendly when he crossed paths with his neighbors. But Darnell wasn't like everyone else in the neighborhood. He had been watching. He had been waiting. Somewhere along the way, his friendly smiles had turned into something darker, something twisted. He had become obsessed with Keisha. Maybe it started when he saw her jogging in the mornings, or when he overheard her laughing with Jamal in the front yard. Maybe it was when he saw her in that wedding dress, realizing she would never be his. Whatever the reason, his obsession had grown into something dangerous. And that night, he decided it was time to act. 10:45 p.m. The house was quiet. The streets outside were still. Jamal Richardson, tired from the long trip back home, barely registered the noise at first. A faint rustling sound. A small thump. It could have been anything. Maybe a raccoon digging through the trash. Maybe a stray dog knocking over a bin. Something harmless. Something ordinary. But something didn't sit right. There was a feeling in his chest, an unease he couldn't explain. His first instinct was to brush it off, but then he saw Keisha sit up in bed, her brows furrowed. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. He nodded. She wasn't the type to get scared easily, but something in her voice made him more alert. He grabbed his phone, shaking off the fatigue, and stepped toward the bedroom door. 10:47 p.m. Jamal reached the bottom of the stairs, his footsteps careful but steady. The house was dimly lit, shadows stretching across the hardwood floor. He glanced toward the living room. Nothing. The kitchen, empty. Then he turned toward the front door. And that's when he saw it. The door was slightly open. His heart pounded. Had they forgotten to lock it? Number he was sure he had checked it when they got home. His mind raced with possibilities. Maybe the wind had pushed it open. Maybe... Then, a figure moved. A dark shape shifted just beyond the doorway, stepping forward into the light, and Jamal's breath caught in his throat. A man stood there, tall, broad, dressed in dark clothing, face partially covered. In his gloved hand, something gleamed under the glow of the porch light. A knife. Jamal's body tensed. Every muscle screamed at him to move, to do something, but his feet felt frozen to the floor. The man didn't speak at first. He just stared. Then, in a voice so calm it made Jamal's skin crawl, he whispered, "Turn around. Walk upstairs. Now." Jamal's mind raced. He could fight. He was strong, had worked with his hands his entire life. But the knife was too close. One wrong move, and he wouldn't even make it up the stairs. And Keisha? She was still upstairs. She had no idea what was happening. "Turn around," the man repeated, stepping inside, shutting the door behind him. This time, Jamal noticed something else. In the man's other hand, pressed low against his hip, was a gun. A choice. Do something now and risk dying, or follow the orders of a man who had already broken into his home. Either way, the fear in Jamal's chest told him one thing. This wasn't just a robbery. Slowly, heart pounding, Jamal turned and walked back upstairs. 10:49 p.m. The bedroom door creaked open. Keisha sat up, confusion flickering in her eyes. "Jamal?" she murmured. Then she saw him. The man standing behind her husband. The gun. The knife. The look in Jamal's eyes. She inhaled sharply, about to scream, but Darnell moved fast. In one swift motion, he shut the bedroom door behind him, locking them all inside. The air in the room thickened. Keisha's breaths came quick and shallow. Her hands trembled as she clutched the blanket, pulling it to her chest as if it could protect her from the horror standing just feet away. Darnell's voice was eerily calm. "Don't fight. Don't scream. Do what I say, and this'll be easier for both of you." Jamal clenched his fists, every nerve in his body screaming to attack, to stop this. But the gun, the knife, the cold, lifeless stare of the man in front of him, this wasn't someone bluffing. This wasn't someone who had second thoughts. Darnell moved with purpose. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a coil of rope. Jamal stiffened. "Sit down," Darnell ordered, motioning to a chair near the dresser. Jamal didn't move. Not yet. "I said, sit down," Darnell repeated, his voice sharper, the gun shifting in his grip. Keisha's voice trembled. Please don't hurt us." Darnell's eyes flicked to her, something unreadable passing over his face. Then, without warning, he stepped forward and struck Jamal across the face with the back of the gun. The crack of metal against skin echoed through the room. Jamal stumbled, catching himself against the dresser, his vision blurring for a second. Blood dripped from his lip. Keisha let out a choked sob. "Now, sit," Darnell growled. Jamal, head spinning, had no choice. He sank onto the chair. His hands were yanked behind him, the rope biting into his wrists as Darnell tied him down. Tight. Too tight. The kind of tight that told Jamal this wasn't just about control. Darnell wanted him to suffer. Then, slowly, deliberately, Darnell turned toward Keisha. 11 p.m. The unimaginable unfolded. Keisha tried to back away, pressing herself against the headboard, but there was nowhere to go. Darnell loomed over her, his shadow stretching across the bed. The silence was suffocating, broken only by Jamal's ragged breathing, the sound of the rope creaking as he struggled against his restraints. "Don't do this," Jamal pleaded, his voice raw, desperate. "Please, take whatever you want, just leave her alone." Darnell didn't respond. He simply reached down, grabbed Keisha by the wrist, and pulled her forward. She let out a strangled cry, thrashing against him, but he was too strong. Jamal yelled, his chair rocking violently as he fought to break free. His heart pounded so hard he thought it would explode. But he couldn't move. He couldn't stop it. Darnell had planned this. Every moment, every action, every second of suffering. And what he did next was even more horrifying. 12:15 a.m. The room reeked of sweat, fear, and something metallic. Blood. The air was thick, suffocating, pressing down like an invisible weight. Jamal Richardson had been fighting for over an hour, struggling against the ropes that bound him to the chair, his wrists raw and bleeding. His body ached from every blow, every cruel twist of the knife that had sliced into his skin. But none of that compared to the agony of what he had just been forced to witness. His wife. His love. Violated in front of him. Her cries had shattered the silence, her pleas falling on deaf ears. He had screamed, cursed, begged. But Darnell Hayes didn't care. He had enjoyed every moment of Jamal's suffering. He had taken his time, savoring the power he held over them. And now, Jamal knew what was coming next. Darnell stood in front of him, gun in hand, his expression unreadable. He wasn't in a hurry. He wasn't nervous. This wasn't some heat-of-the-moment crime. This was planned. Deliberate. Cold. He wiped his forehead with the back of his gloved hand, then crouched down so he was at eye level with Jamal. "You fought hard, man. I'll give you that," Darnell said, shaking his head slightly. "Most men? They break way sooner. But you kept fighting." Jamal swallowed hard, his chest heaving. His mind was racing, trying to find something, anything, to say that might change the outcome. His mouth was dry, his body weak. But his eyes still burned with fury. "Why?" Jamal croaked, his voice hoarse. "Why are you doing this?" Darnell tilted his head, as if considering the question. Then, with a slight smirk, he shrugged. "Because I can." Jamal clenched his fists, the rope digging deeper into his skin. His eyes darted toward Keisha, who lay curled up on the bed, her body trembling. Her face was streaked with tears, her breathing uneven. He wanted to tell her it was going to be okay, that he would get them out of this, that this wasn't how their story ended. But deep down, he knew the truth. This was it. Darnell stood up, adjusting his grip on the gun. You know what the sad part is, he mused. If you wasn't here, me and Keisha could have had something real nice. But you had to get in the way. Jamal's nostrils flared, his teeth clenched. Even in his final moments, he wasn't going to let this man have the satisfaction of breaking him completely. He spat at Darnell's feet. You're a coward. Darnell's smirk faded. Then, bang! The gunshot ripped through the air, so loud it seemed to shake the entire house. Jamal jerked, his body going rigid. For a split second, he didn't feel anything. Then, a deep, searing pain exploded in his chest. His breath hitched, his vision blurred. A warmth spread beneath him, soaking his shirt, pooling onto the floor. Keisha's scream cut through the silence. A scream so raw, so full of agony, it didn't sound human. Jamal's head tilted back. His eyes, those strong, determined eyes, began to lose focus. He tried to speak, but no words came. His lips parted slightly, as if he wanted to tell Keisha something, but the words never came. His body slumped forward. And then, he was gone. Keisha's sobs filled the room, her body shaking uncontrollably. She tried to crawl toward him, but her limbs were weak, her mind unable to process the horror in front of her. Jamal? No. No. Please? But he wasn't moving. He wasn't breathing. Darnell exhaled, tilting his head as he admired his work. He tapped the gun against his thigh, then turned his attention to Keisha. She recoiled as he stepped closer, her entire body screaming for her to run, to fight, to do something. But she was powerless. He knelt beside her, brushing a strand of hair from her damp face. She flinched at his touch, a whimper escaping her lips. I ain't done yet, he whispered. Her stomach dropped. A new wave of terror crashed over her, drowning out the grief. He wasn't going to kill her. Not yet. He had other plans. Darnell reached into his pocket, pulling out another piece of rope. He grabbed her wrist and began tying her hands behind her back. Keisha tried to resist, her body instinctively pulling away, but she was too weak. Don't fight, he murmured. I'll be back for you soon enough. She choked on a sob as he tightened the knots, the rough fibers biting into her skin. Then, without another word, Darnell stood up, glanced at Jamal's lifeless body one last time, and walked out of the room. The sound of his footsteps echoed down the hall. Then, silence. Keisha lay motionless, her mind racing. The man who had destroyed her life was still in the house, and he had no intention of letting her go. But as the minutes passed, a single thought began to cut through the fog of fear and grief. She had one chance, one moment to escape. But could she take it? Keisha lay frozen, her breath shallow, her pulse thundering in her ears. The ropes around her wrists were tight, cutting into her skin, each movement sending fresh pain through her body. But none of that mattered now. None of it compared to the horror she had just witnessed. Jamal was gone. The man she loved, the man she had promised to spend her life with, was slumped over in that chair, his body lifeless, his blood pooling beneath him. And she was next. Darnell had made that clear. He wasn't finished with her yet. Then, the flick of a lighter. He had stepped outside. Keisha's mind snapped into action. This was her chance. Her only chance. A picture frame had fallen off the nightstand during the struggle. The glass shattered into jagged shards on the floor just a few feet away. Slowly, carefully, she shifted her body. The ropes dug deeper, but she gritted her teeth and inched closer. Her fingertips stretched, shaking, reaching for the largest piece of glass. Just a little more. Almost there. Her fingers closed around the sharp edge. Pain shot through her palm as the glass sliced into her skin. But she didn't let go. She couldn't. She twisted the shard in her grip and began sawing at the ropes. Outside, Darnell exhaled a long stream of smoke, his posture relaxed. He wasn't worried. He thought she was still tied up, broken, too weak to fight. He had all the time in the world. He took another drag of his cigarette, staring out into the dark street. Inside, Keisha bit down on her lip to keep from crying out as the last strand of rope snapped. Her wrists were free. She wasted no time. Ignoring the pain, ignoring the blood dripping from her fingers, she scrambled to her feet. Her legs were weak, shaking so badly she almost collapsed, but she forced herself to move. She staggered across the room, each step sending a fresh jolt of pain through her battered body. The window was locked, but that didn't matter. She grabbed the nearest object, a lamp, and smashed it against the glass. The shattering sound was deafening. Outside, Darnell's head snapped up. Inside, Keisha didn't hesitate. She hoisted herself onto the windowsill, ignoring the shards digging into her hands and feet. She swung her legs over, her body trembling, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Then she jumped, barefoot, bleeding. She hit the ground hard, her ankle twisting painfully. But she didn't stop. Behind her, a sound. A door slamming open. "Hey!" Darnell had realized. Her body screamed for her to stop, to collapse, to give in. But she forced herself to move faster. She stumbled into the street, her arms flailing, her voice raw as she screamed for help. "Somebody help me. Please." A porch light flickered on. Then another. A curtain was pulled aside. A door creaked open. A neighbor, an older woman in a robe, stepped onto her porch, her face contorted with confusion. Then she saw Keisha. Saw the blood. The terror in her eyes. The woman gasped, rushing toward her. "Oh my God, honey, what happened?" Keisha collapsed onto the grass, her body giving out. The woman knelt beside her, her hands shaking as she reached for her phone. 911 operator. 911, what's your emergency? Panicked neighbor. A woman just ran out of the house. She's screaming about her husband. There's blood all over her. The operator's voice remained steady. Is she injured? Is she conscious? The neighbor glanced down at Keisha, who was sobbing, barely able to speak. She's hurt. She's barefoot, covered in scratches. Oh my God, there's so much blood. Inside the house, Darnell stood in the doorway, watching, his fists clenched, his chest rising and falling rapidly. He had underestimated her. She wasn't broken after all. He took a step forward, ready to go after her. But then, sirens. In the distance, the wail of police sirens sliced through the night air, growing louder, closer. Darnell stiffened. His eyes flicked toward the flashing red and blue lights appearing at the end of the street. The nightmare wasn't over yet. The flashing red and blue lights painted the neighborhood in streaks of urgency, illuminating the quiet suburban street where everything had gone so terribly wrong. The first patrol car screeched to a stop in front of the house, its tires skidding slightly on the pavement. Before the vehicle had even fully stopped, officers were already out, hands on their holsters, scanning the area. Keisha was on the ground, trembling, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Her neighbor hovered over her, one hand on Keisha's shoulder, the other gripping her phone. "Over here!" she cried, waving at the officers. One of them, a tall, stocky man with a commanding voice, rushed toward her, dropping to one knee. "Ma'am, are you hurt? Can you tell me what happened?" Keisha's lips trembled, her entire body convulsing from shock. She tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she lifted a shaking hand and pointed toward the house. Tears spilled down her cheeks as her voice finally broke free. "My husband, he killed my husband." The officer's expression darkened. He turned toward the house, his grip tightening on his weapon. "Unit 2, move in. We have a confirmed homicide scene inside. Suspect may still be in the vicinity." A second patrol car pulled up, then another. Officers poured onto the scene, their movements swift, efficient. 2 officers helped Keisha to her feet, wrapping a blanket around her trembling shoulders, guiding her toward the back of an ambulance that had just arrived. She barely registered the paramedic checking her vitals. Her mind was elsewhere, inside that house, in that room, where Jamal still sat, bound, lifeless, alone. Inside, officers moved cautiously, their weapons drawn. The door had been left open, swaying slightly in the warm night breeze. The first officer stepped inside, scanning the dark interior with a trained eye. A metallic scent filled the air. Thick, unmistakable. The stench of blood. Then, they saw him. Jamal Richardson, slumped in the chair, his head tilted at an unnatural angle, his chest soaked in deep crimson. The rope still bound his wrists, the fibers digging into his skin. A single gunshot wound to the heart. The room was eerily still, as if the violence that had taken place there had frozen time itself. "We've got a deceased male. Gunshot wound to the chest. Crime scene secured. Suspect not in sight." But Darnell was nowhere to be found. Back outside, an officer scanned the street, his radio crackling to life. "Be advised, we have a possible suspect fleeing on foot, heading eastbound on Birchwood Avenue. Description: black male, mid-40s, approximately 6 feet 2 inches, wearing dark clothing. Suspect may be armed." A new surge of adrenaline shot through the officers. They moved quickly, fanning out, their eyes sweeping the area. 2 blocks away, near an alley between houses, a figure darted between shadows. A man, running. His movements erratic, desperate. Darnell Hayes. His clothes were soaked in blood. Jamal's blood. His breath came in ragged bursts as he sprinted down the sidewalk, his mind racing for an escape plan. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Keisha was supposed to be tied up. She was supposed to be broken. He had underestimated her. He had made a mistake. And now, the police were closing in. "Stop! Hands up!" Darnell didn't stop. He veered sharply into the backyard of an unfamiliar house, knocking over a trash can as he stumbled. He could hear the officers behind him, their boots pounding against the pavement. Panic surged through him. He had to disappear. He had to. A sharp pain exploded in his side as he slammed into the ground. An officer had tackled him, driving him into the dirt with unrelenting force. Darnell thrashed, grunting, but the weight on his back was too much. His arms were yanked behind him, cold metal snapping around his wrists. "Suspect in custody." The street fell silent, except for the heavy breathing of the officers and the distant sound of Keisha sobbing in the ambulance. It was over. Investigation begins. Detectives uncovered something chilling in his home, a collection of disturbing evidence that painted a picture of obsession, control, and a mind twisted by dark desires. Darnell had a history. Several women had come forward in the past, accusing him of sexual assault, harassment, and intimidation. But none of the cases had led to convictions. The courtroom was silent as Keisha took the stand. She recounted every horrifying detail, the moment Jamal was taken from her, the way Darnell smirked as he tormented them, the cold look in his eyes when he pulled the trigger. The jury watched, some visibly shaken as she described her desperate escape. Darnell sat motionless. The evidence was overwhelming. The hidden cameras, the prior accusations, the premeditation. The judge's voice rang through the courtroom as he handed down the sentence, life in prison, without the possibility of parole. Keisha closed her eyes, exhaling a breath she had been holding for months. Justice had been served, but nothing could bring Jamal back. Nothing could erase the nightmare. Evil doesn't always lurk in the shadows. It sometimes lives right next door. Keisha and Jamal had no reason to fear their neighbor. He was friendly, familiar, part of the community. But behind that facade was a predator, watching, waiting. This case is a chilling reminder that danger can come from the people we least expect. Now, we turn to you. If you were in Keisha's situation, trapped, terrified, with no one coming to save you, what would you have done? Could you have stayed calm? Could you have fought back? Let us know in the comments. And if you found this story gripping, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because these stories deserve to be told.